And welcome back to Pierre Jonker. We spoke some while back in our first chapter about our time at Side together in the South African Army, the training, and then our trip up to the Limpopo River. Good to have you back, Pierre.
Thanks, Steve. It was great being here before, and thanks for inviting me back.
Yeah, good. So we are going to launch now into our time spent up in the operational area in the border war. I was just thinking, Pierre, I bought my old 6th Infantry beret, you know, for the occasion. Nogal, what have you got? Something hidden there as well?
I don't have that anymore. I had burned it, but I can put this on. How's that?
Looks good. Mine is so small. I think my head's got bigger as I've got older. You know, my ego's got bigger. So I don't know if
I think you just got big-headed with age, eh?
Yeah, no, it could be age. Yeah. Pierre, so I've made a few notes because so much happened. As I think you know, I kept a diary of my time in the operational area, and many years ago I typed it out and put it into a bit of a booklet. So scanning through it, it refreshed my memory. So I'll refer every now and then to some notes if you don't mind. All right, so let's make a start. We're back in Grahamstown. It is 1982, middle of 82, and they now tell us we're going up to the border between SWA and Angola for 6 months. As I recall, we went to the QM store, we handed in our mattresses and our blankets, and they gave us fresh uniforms, and we got our rifles from them, our personal weapons, our R4s. I think when we got to the border, we were given machine guns, mag machine guns. We never took them from Grahamstown, if I recall.
No.
And a lot of excitement. So we were, just to refresh, one company, Alpha Company, of 5 platoons. You and I were in platoon 1, each platoon consisting around about 30 men, divided into 3 sections, and you were an internal commander of one of those sections. And we were now being sent up to take over 3 months occupation of a base on the border. But first of all, your recollections, if any, of the flight up and our way there.
Yeah, Steve, they transported us to Port Elizabeth, where we boarded SAF Air, because I don't know if you recollect, but the Americans sold us the Transalls and the Hercules, the C-130s and the C-160, under the strict proviso that they were not supposed to be transporting passengers. Yeah. So they were called SAF Air. They weren't really part of the Air Force, so to speak, and we weren't classified as passengers. We were cargo. But we boarded the Flossie in Port Elizabeth, and it's about between 3 and 5 hours. I can't remember, depending on where you went to. Grootfontein, obviously, it's a little bit because we landed in Grootfontein. So, but anyway, yeah, you get on board that thing, and it's got cargo net seating. And you sit inside this thing, you sink away, and you're trapped almost. And down the sides of the fuselage, and then also there was an internal rack that they had suspended seats on. So you're actually sitting knee to knee with other guys in the thing. And I can't remember which NCO it was that came scrambling over everybody, and they said, as jy gaan hoes in jou bereid, roep, kos nie op die vloer. And what I do remember is that when we took off, there was no real insulation in these planes. You could actually see the hydraulic run up and down as the swim worked, and then you could watch the rivets freeze over as you gained altitude, and it became very cold in that plane. And then on descent, which was quite a fast descent anyway, that condensation, or that started thawing and dripping on us. So we got a little bit of rain inside an aeroplane.
It was pretty cold up there.
Yeah,
and arriving at Grootfontein, how we were at high altitude and then we spiraled down in a vortex. Suddenly the plane banked sharp and we landed, and the landing sort of length felt about 20 meters. We came to quick stop, and they got us out of there. Sorry, Pierre, can I just do a comms test again? I'm getting quite a lot of static on my side. Are you seeing me? Is your picture freezing or anything? Okay, we are back with a better link. So Pierre, we landed in Grootfontein, spent the night there, terrible conditions. I just remember it being so hot and dusty and grimy, completely different to what we were used to. And the next day we were in Oshivelo training camp nearby, where we spent about a week. Oshivelo, the dreaded Oshivelo. What are your memories of that?
Flies and sand and heat in the day, cold in the winter. Tents that were drafty, to say the least. I think they were old tents, like really, really old. I think they'd been used in the bases up north previously and then sent down for retirement. So, yeah, I didn't have that many good memories of it. Overloaded with officers and senior NCOs, all of them with a lot of experience. I think, and from what I remember, and you may recall the same, Steve, is that our officers, the NCOs, sort of took a backseat while these guys ran us through our paces, took the drills. So we did patrols, contact actions, ambush, all that stuff we did under their supervision and their say-so. And I believe they were testing us as well as our officers to see whether our training had been up to scratch. So yeah, that is sort of my recollection of it. And I was actually quite glad when we got on, I think we got on we got on Bedfords to leave there, which I was quite happy to do, having ducked out of one guard duty situation. I was given my teeth.
Yeah, correct. So they then told us we were now going to be sent to Okatope, which was a base not too far from Oshivelo, a couple of clicks away, 200 clicks or so up the road. And so we now arrived in the operational area. So our base was next to the tar road that ran up north to Ondangwa. If I make a mistake, interrupt me. It was a long time ago. And it was one of the newest bases. It was square with big earth walls and sandbags, and it had amenities like a canteen with a table tennis table and a pool table and the famous ice cream machine. I think there was later a swimming pool there. I don't recall it in our time. But now this is where we were to be positioned for 3 months, and our task was to seek and destroy, to look for the SWAPO guerrillas in the countryside. But perhaps we should just set the scene, Pierre, of the war up there. So there were actually 2 wars going on. The one was between the South African Defence Force intercepting SWAPO guerrillas who had come down from Angola. And the other war was between the Angolan government in southern Angola and UNITA. So, and they were fought in 2 different theaters. What's your summary of what were our tactics, the South Africans in Owamboland, which is where we were for this period? How did our command structure deploy us to try to detect the enemy?
Well, Steve, we did saturation patrolling. So essentially, I was never privy, and maybe the officers that you're going to interview, guys like Stan and Dave Bosman, will be able to shed more light on it. But I believe that we were sent out to dominate a certain area, to be seen, actually, to be there. So in my mind, that's not really... What it does, it actually, you saturate the area with troops, so you try and prevent SWAPO from moving through. But SWAPO will plan People's Liberation Army of Namibia, the fighters were very savvy, and they used the local population to their advantage, which is part of Mao's dictum, swim with the fish. So I think we were very wrong. My personal opinion, having, and hindsight's 2020, but listening to and hearing what happened in the Rhodesian conflict and how those guys dealt with things initially, not where it got basically where you had almost conventional stand-up fights on a daily basis. But that's what we did. We saturated an area. So, and I think we worked within a certain boundary as a platoon, and there would be platoons on either side of us, or above or behind us, north, south, east, west. So you dominate that area for a period of time, but then you are withdrawn. It did work in the sense that you did surprise people sometimes, but not that often. You know, especially down in that area, it was far more open, and it was a long way from the Yati, from Angola and Namibia and South West African border. So they were, I think they also dispersed into smaller groups. They may cross initially in bigger groups, but they dispersed. And we're not talking about the guys that we were up against at Alpha Tower. That was a completely different kettle of fish. But that was what I believe the doctrine was to do the saturation patrolling, which if you can dominate the area, but you've got to be able to also be a little bit more subtle than we were. You know, a bunch of white boys blundering through the bush, making a lot of noise, you know, is not going to stack up against four or five guys who are bush savvy, who have the ears and the eyes of the local population behind them. And and mostly they did avoid contact unless they felt that they had the upper hand. You know, so yeah, that's what I felt about our tactics initially. You know, so I don't know what your thoughts are and how you think of it. You know, a platoon of 30 men is actually quite an unwieldy thing, because it can get spread out over 400, 500 meters. So you know, if you hit a contact, depending on which flank or in front, it can take a while if you actually now go into your doctrines, your contact left, contact right. This section has to swing around. This one has to wait. That type of thing. By then, those guys have, you know, they've had more toes of a Roman sandal. Those guys could have run. Yeah. They could have run almost anybody.
Yeah, I got the impression when I first got there that this was a vast, wide open land, and the further south you were away from the border, from the Cut Plain, the less the chances are that you would bump into the enemy.
Vegetation.
And the vegetation was also more sparse further down. The further north you went, it got
correct.
And it also appeared as if the local people were perhaps better disposed to us further south. Up north, they were a lot more hostile. And I believe that a year or two before we came, there were large armed groups of SWAPO guerrillas walking around up north near the Cup Lane. Groups of 90, 100 men pushing up to 200 men, and they were virtually unmolested because South Africa didn't have the manpower at that stage. And I got the impression that our generals had devised a strategy whereby they said, look, let's call up the conscripts and let's get them to saturate the ground, just to cover the area, get boots on the ground, and that will force the enemy to keep their heads down. And that was the situation when we arrived. So we were tasked with walking these patrols, which typically were 5-day or 1-week patrols. They went on sometimes 2-3 weeks, where we would go out into the bush and we would sleep there at night. We would hole up somewhere in a thicket or in a more thickly wooded area, hopefully undetected. And the next day we would now patrol, seek and destroy, so-called. Effectively, what we were doing on a pre-planned basis was moving from location to location. And they would be possibly 10 kilometers away from each other. So the end of day one, you would have walked to perhaps a school. Then you would monitor activity at the school and perhaps lay in ambush that night on a road outside the school, because there was a curfew after, I think, sunset. Then the next day there was another location, perhaps a church 8 or 9 kilometers away. And then perhaps a small cluster of shops, cooker shops, bottle stores, and so on. And so we moved in this manner, hoping to find information, to bump into the enemy. But it was a great frustration at Okatope because we just couldn't find them. They seemed to elude us a lot. And so while we arrived with a lot of anticipation and excitement, it was deflating because we were now out there walking. Do you remember us leaving for our first patrol from Okatope?
At sunset, just after dark.
Yes.
If I remember correctly, because there were 4 SAI guys that we were relieving. And I remember walking out and there were two of these 4 SAI guys were standing outside the berm. And they were just coming back in through that one exit, like a gate almost, that was on the eastern side. And we all exited through there. And they still said good luck to us. I remember that, yeah.
And do you remember the
freezing cold patrol?
And do you remember that Dominee was at the gate waiting for us, and we all gathered around him and he prayed for us before we left? And I was a little bit sort of, I'd never encountered this before. You know, I had never played in the schools where you prayed before a rugby game, and so this was, which was the norm in many schools in South Africa. But we were gathered around, and I thought, what's he going to pray for? You know, is he going to pray that we kill the enemy? That wouldn't be very Christian-like. But he was very balanced. He prayed that we kept safe and so on. And so we went out very excited. And it's interesting looking at my diary because I've got a record of the patrols as they took place. And the first 2 or 3, we walked through a variety of terrain, thick bush, thick sand underfoot, and then we'd suddenly come out into open expanse. And in the distance, you would see a kraal or headman's building and some plowed fields, Mahangu plowed fields. But I say in my diary, and it brings back the memories of just how tough the walking was. You know, we carried those heavy backpacks, which I guess must have been about 40 kilograms heavy. And then we had all our webbing with our magazines, and we carried our rifles and water. Water was a big problem. Of course, the wells were widely dispersed, and we never knew where they were. We would try and track them down on a map. We'd get there, we'd find the water hole was dry. Then we'd have to ask the locals, where is fresh water? Then they'd send us off in some other direction. We'd walk for 3 or 4 kilometers. It was always a great relief to come across a well where we could actually get fresh water. And then the heat and the flies everywhere. Yeah, so just very difficult conditions, you know, that I wasn't used to. You had lived in Namibia. So I don't know if those conditions were as strange to you as to me. What are your thoughts about life on patrol?
It was tough, Steve. There's no denying it. It doesn't matter if you're used to it. I mean, living in Windhoek, you do get a lot of exposure to the heat, and it does get hot. We would get 42, 44 degrees in summer there, and but it still takes its toll on you. And then obviously with the heat and the sweat came the wapani flies, and they would crawl into any orifice they could.
Yeah.
Before I left to come to the border, my mom gave me a mosquito net. And she said, on condition this comes back in one piece. Well, it didn't make it back in one piece, because after that first patrol, what we did was I cut it up and I gave the guys in my section, and I can't remember if I had any other left, but we we made these little shrouds that you could put under your bush hat and then tuck into your shirt, just to try and keep those buggers off you, because they
we used to look like
incredibly
we used to look like beekeepers. We had this bloody bush culture. I mean, they were intolerable conditions to work under. In those early days, thank heavens we never wandered into the enemy. I don't know how we would have reacted. I don't know if we would have been able to see them through our screens.
The thing is, we might have, we never saw them, and they just ran off because these guys are blind as bats, So it could have happened. But the other thing I remember that.
Where were they? Where were the enemy? We couldn't find them.
They were there. They were there, but also, I think also, Steve, I think it was a cyclical war, in the sense that they would Plan would send fighters into Owamboland, and then, as they filtered down towards we were at Okatope, they would be bumping into South African troops. This was before they had this Southwest African Territorial Force troops, and they were being raised, I think, at that time. So they would bump into us, they would bump into 101 Battalion, they'd bump into the Romeo Mike teams that the Bats ran, they would run into the Koevoet teams, who were constantly on patrol and up there. So by the time they might not even have got to us, and even by the time they got to us, they might have been pared down and slimmed down from a detachment of, say, 120. There may have only been 10 left, because some had been killed, some had been wounded, some had been captured, some had turned back. And their big drive was obviously to dominate Owamboland, because they were Owamba, but they also wanted to get into the farming area south of Oshivelo, into past Etosha, down into Grootfontein, Otavi, into those areas. So they could start, or they could cause mayhem there and instill fear within the whites to try and drive them away off the land. And so I believe by the time they got to us, they were very few and very far, and these were probably very good guys who knew their business, to have filtered all the way down, and having escaped a bunch of people who've been trying to kill them constantly for maybe 2 weeks. But we did have that where we didn't see the contact to Europe, but we had that one incident with Koevoet, which you remember.
Yeah,
so that was our third patrol with tracks.
That was on our third patrol. So actually, looking back, we saw a little bit of the action fairly quickly. So it was probably 10 or 12 days into our arriving at Okatope, and we got party to a sort of a contact thing was going on, and it was the Koevoet, and they called in a gunship, and so how did that pan out?
Gunships. From where I remember it, Steve, and also my memory is vague, because my memory of, for example, just what happened in Meebos, and then you read Cassie's writings, there was some stuff that I was completely wrong about. But my recollection is that we did meet, we picked up some tracks, and I believe they were the information was radioed through, and because Koevoet just monitors all the nets, they picked us up, and within half an hour they passed us, and we were just then told to just go down, put up stop groups, wait. And it wasn't that far, because you could hear it, you couldn't see it, but we heard the contact, and we heard the gunships, and I tuned into the air frequency, and I could hear them talk to the Koevoet guys on the ground. I believe there were 3 planned fighters, and they got all 3. And if I remember correctly, the last one, they got the 2 on the ground, and they couldn't find the last one. And then the choppers said they're taking fire, they're being shot at. And this guy climbed a tree. He climbed up in a tree, and he was shooting. And that's where I sort of started. You take a second guess, because you think you're this macho, well-trained troop in the South African Defence Force, you're invincible. And we were well-trained. Then you also realize that this guy, he's got the courage to know he's not going to die. He's not going to curl up in a ball. He's not going to give up. He's going to see if he can maybe take something with him. and you've got to respect that.
Yeah.
You gotta admire the courage that man showed at the end of the day, and he died for the cause.
Yeah.
And he was, he believed in it so much that he's prepared to die for it. So that was our first sort of initiation, if you want to call it. And unfortunately, I don't know. It's difficult to say. Again, Steve, that was quite far to the east, where there was less. I wouldn't say we were in line with Okankolo, but we were out that way, and that's probably where a lot of them passed us, because we patrolled on both sides of that main road.
Yeah, that
And
was.
I think to the west of the road, it was absolutely dead.
Yeah, according to my diary, that first contact took place in the Ilombi area, and my recollection of it was, yes, Koevoet seemed to be chasing down a group of guys, and then they got us on the radio and they asked us to approach and to act as a stopper group on the one side, so that they could try and herd them into us. But then, if you remember, we heard that banging on the roof. This frantic banging on the roof, and we came across a headman's hut next to a mahango field. It was a tall plantation, like a sugarcane plantation, and we couldn't work out what was going on. And this guy was up there banging, and eventually we sent someone over, and he said he was fixing the roof because the rain was coming or something. And then, as we were sort of working our way through past his kraal, a gunship came over, and I remember it clearly coming from behind us on the right like this. And we looked up, and the gunner was sitting in the door, and it was fairly low, just above us. And I remember he had boots on, which were sort of sticking out the side of the door, and he had the machine gun between his legs, and he had looked like a pair of Tom Cruise Ray-Bans on, and he waved.
Probably did.
He waved down at us, and I sort of waved up. I think a few of us did. And he flew over the plantation for about 50 meters, and the next minute he opened fire, which was now in front of us here. And he went duck, 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 duck. It sounded like he only fired about 5 shots, but the helicopter swung in the sky. It sort of went duck, 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 and it came back like that. And he had taken out the guy in the observation post. And at the same time, we could hear the Caspers of the Koevoet revving some distance away, and they they ran over a guy, as I recall, and they got the second one. So that was my first recollection of it. But I was mindful that it wasn't really our contact. We were party to an action that the others had directed and arranged, and so there was a bit of an empty feeling thereafter. But still, we had been up there for probably about 2 weeks, and we had seen a little bit of what was going on. And it also struck me that, this bush is not so empty of enemy as you think it is. You better keep your eyes open, So we've spoken about the Koevoet now. How did they fit in to the war? Because, of course, we were army, whereas they originated in the Southwest African Police. They were policemen. How did they fit in? What did they do, and how effective generally were they?
They were police counter-insurgency, and they were trained. A lot of their training, the first guys were trained on the job. And remind me when we get to talk about Okankolo and Funky Town and that little base around the culvert there. Just remind me about the story when we saw these guys in Funky Town. Just when we get there. Well, I can tell it now because it's put to Koevoet. In those days.
Yeah, let's leave it for later. Yeah.
Okay, we'll do it later. So Sterkans Dreyer, who General Dreyer is dead now, I believe he's passed away. he had this vision of putting mixed teams into the field that are highly mobile and that are skilled in tracking and very proficient in using their arms. So Koevoet were initially used a hodgepodge of vehicles, but eventually the Casper was designed almost specifically for them. And then what they did is they adapted those vehicles. They mounted, I mean, I think Ondurant, you can correct me, I think he had 20mm Hispano cannons mounted on his, from a jet aircraft, from a fighter plane. So they armed these as heavily as they could. And they would use black policemen, Ovambo policemen, and they'd also use turned plane fighters who would then give him the AK or his weapon with the firing pin filed off, so he couldn't shoot you in the back until you trusted him. And the effectiveness came because I believe, and we touched on this privately, is that it was mixed teams. So you had people who knew the bush, who could read tracks, who knew what to look and listen for. And then you had what policemen with them who basically ran the teams. Normally, I believe they operated in 4 Caspers with a backup. So they had, eventually it was called, I thought it was 4 Caspers and a Strandwolf. I think the Strandwolf was the vehicle that carried logistics. So it had tires, it had ammunition, it had medical supplies in case any nonsense happened. And they would pick up spoor and they would just run on it. The trackers would get on the ground and they'd run, and the guys would follow in the Caspers. And contact was just they didn't have a set doctrine for it. There was no training for it. So they milled around through the contact area, and quite a lot of the hits on the Caspers were from own fire. And the guys on the ground would just hit the dirt and keep their heads down until it settled, or they could get up safely and into a vehicle to continue the fight. And they were highly effective. Speak on a correction, but I believe at least 70, maybe even 80% of all kills were due to them in Owamboland. We're not counting what happened in Angola with 3-2 and some of the other units that operate there on a far more active basis. But within Owamboland, they were very, very effective. And the Romeo Mike teams, which were bats in buffels with Ovambo trackers, I believe, they were not as effective, but they were also almost based on what Koevoet were using.
Yeah, you know, what struck me about the Koevoet when we got there was that they were a law unto themselves. They never fell under the military authorization of the areas. We were sector bound. We had very clear definitions of our borders that we couldn't cross. This was our rectangle that we operated in. You do not cross. Whereas they came in their Caspers, they were on a spoor, and they could cross sectors, and they could rapidly gain ground on the insurgents they were chasing, because the Ovambo troopers who were running on the spoor were fresh. All they ran with was their rifle and a water bottle, and their kit, the heavy kit, was in the back of the Casper. And then they would run perhaps for half an hour, and then they'd rotate with fresh troops in the Casper. So they had this ability to advance very quickly. And then they spoor snayed.
Yeah.
So that as they were running on the spoor, they identified gaps in the foliage ahead, put their minds into the enemy's mind and said, if I was running this way, where would I go now? Okay, there's a natural gap there, I'll go through there, or I'd take cover in that thicket. And they would leapfrog, and they'd send guys ahead, and they'd pick the spoor up 300 or 400 meters later, working 2 Caspers like that. So I recall them being incredibly efficient at what they were doing. They were fairly new when we got there. We were there 82, and I think they started up around 1980, and they were increasing their strength and number of vehicles and their manpower as we got there. And certainly these guys came to figure large in our lives. I'm sure you'll agree. They were also more brutal. You know, the Koevoet, very controversial. People who saw them in action, everyone has a strong opinion on them. Their interrogation of people, what we saw, what I recall, was brutal. And there were guys amongst us who were not happy with the way that they treated the civilians and treated the.
Steve, can I just ask you? Sorry.
Yeah.
Can I just ask you? Your section, you guys saw something at a kraal with regard to Koevoet.
That happened.
We didn't see. Steve and my sections were there. We didn't see this.
Yeah.
Can you just maybe elaborate a bit on that?
That occurred about a month later after we first got there. Yeah. So we were, our platoon was in a temporary base in the middle of the bush. We'd gone down for lunch and we were lounging around. We were scattered in a wide sort of triangle. We had guards out and I think we were cooking up our food. And if you recall, suddenly we saw two Caspers come past us, probably about 400 or 500 meters away. And they'd just gone out of view when firing broke out. But it was obscured. We couldn't see what was going on. And quickly, Lieutenant Kallie dispatched a section to go and see what was going on. So that was our section with Alan at the head. And we left, we ran just with our rifles and our webbing, and we got to a kraal, and the Caspers were there. They had stopped and they'd made contact with the enemy. Sort of as we got there, the firing stopped. And as I remember, there were a few injured people lying around in the kraal who'd been hit by a crossfire. One of the enemy had been killed, and he was next to the Casper. And the Koevoet were now debussing from the Casper. And the guy on top, in those days, they used to fire the machine gun from the top. Later on, they controlled it so that the gunner didn't have to sit up there. He could fire it from inside the Casper. He was climbing down, and he was quite rattled, you know. And he sort of he looked at us and he said, "I'm not hit," and he was checking himself. And then he pointed to deflection marks on the Casper where he had been hit. And with some exasperation, he pointed at the dead guerrilla and he said, "This bugger was running straight at me, firing straight at me in the turret," as if disbelieving that someone could be so arrogant as to do it, you know, or have such the gall, you know, firing at me kind of thing. And we stood around, and there was blood spoor going out of the kraal. The injured people were quite badly injured, you know, caught in the crossfire. And that's the thing about war, and that's the thing that you don't really prepare for when you're in training. You don't think of that, of the injured civilians and so on. There was a very clear blood spoor leading out of the kraal, so they hit another guy. But what was interesting was complete relaxation broke out. I expected the Koevoet to saddle up and follow this other spoor. And meanwhile, they went over to the dead one and they checked him for, checked his documentation and so on, and they relaxed, and eventually they tied up the body onto the top of the mudguard in true Koevoet fashion on the Casper. Then they gathered a whole lot of villagers around from sort of huts we could see in the distance. They brought them all, the Owambo troops went out and brought them back. And they gave them, shall we say, an impromptu lecture in what happens to their friends in SWAPO. You know, and they manhandled them. They treated them roughly, and we were very young. We were completely taken aback. You know, we just stood there watching the beatings going on, and too young and inexperienced and indecisive to intervene, and shocked. And with the policeman at the same time lecturing us, saying, "You army guys, you need to wake up. This is what you need to do to these people here who support the enemy," you know. And my mind was thinking, first of all, look, this is really brutal what you're doing. Secondly, we don't know if these villagers were the enemy, but his logic was, well, if an enemy ran through his kraal, he's obviously a friend of theirs. And then I knew at the back of my mind that the villagers, the local people, did support the enemy. They fed them at night and so on. And so I was filled with very confusing thoughts and so on. And that was the incident with the Koevoet. And then, you know, the guys who were there, speaking to them later in life, they all recall how shocked they were by what they saw. and how they regret not taking a stand at the time. They say, had we been more experienced, more mature, we would have stopped the cops from doing that. You know? So I started off saying that the Koevoet were a law unto themselves, and they were in that way. That was my recollection. And certainly they were kind of like, they were the, you know, I want to say the dogs of war up there. That's a derogatory term in a way, but on the other hand, it's the real savage guys who were at the enemy, you know. And they got paid kopgeld, so they got paid per kill, which was further incentive. I don't know how savory that is to have as an incentive in a war. But to me, the Koevoet were mesmerizing, and these sort of agents of death, you know, very brutal, hard men at the sharp end of the war, mesmerizing, and yet at the same time, I was kind of repulsed by what they were doing. And then I thought to myself, well, wars all over the world, you get your Koevoets, eh? You have them everywhere. So that was my recollections of them. Yeah, and we went on to see much more of them in later.
I know. That's right, yeah, Steve. Just my recollections of not having been anywhere, but speaking to Alan later in life and to Brent Elliott. Both of them actually have no regard for Koevoet, regardless of what they achieved, because of what I think heavily influenced what they saw that day, and then also by other incidents that you heard of and stuff that filtered through the grapevine about them. You remember they had their base on the western side of the road, about a kilometer and a half up the road from us.
Yeah.
Did you ever visit it?
No.
I went in there once, and they had this party trick where they would the new guy give him an RPG, and then aim straight up, fire straight up at the sky, and then they'd back off giggling, put their hands in their ears because they knew it was going to happen. And the back blast would turn the poor guy black, the guy who fired the rocket. So they tried it on us, but I don't think they got us because we'd heard about it before. But that's often, I don't know if you remember, but we'd see RPG rockets just fly around or in the sky, out of that camp sometimes for no reason. And that was them introducing a new recruit to the RPG. Yeah. So yeah, they were there, and I don't know how often that base was actually occupied, because sometimes it seemed empty. But like you were saying, they were in the embryonic stage of being developed, and I don't think they had all of them had vehicles all the time, as well. As I'll talk about a little bit later.
Yeah.
Or armored personnel carriers, Caspers, those things. So yeah.
They were certainly a ragged bunch of hard guys, and in the beginning they struggled along. They were there to steal parts for their Caspers, and there wasn't a lot of support for them. There was antagonism between them and the army, the command structures, and especially as the Koevoet became more and more effective.
Yeah, I believe that the army thought that Owamboland was their province, and that they should be allowed to run it and do how they wanted to run their war. And then Hans Dreyer came up with these precocious ideas. Initially the guys, he took a lot of ideas and tactics from how the scouts were, the Zulu scouts in Rhodesia, and he brought that there. And again, the rigid, we touched on this in the last chat, is the rigidness of the doctrine within the South African Defence Force. It didn't allow for lateral movement. So people like Jan Breitenbach were an exception, because Breitenbach thought out the box continually. Always tried to improve things. There's the other guys almost, it's a terrible word to use blindly, but if you wanted to further your career, if you were a career officer in the South African Defence Force, you listened and obeyed, if that makes sense. So you enforced the doctrine, and you made sure that's the way it is supposed to be. That's what the manual says. Let's do it this way. If not, I'm going to make your life.
Well, that is the case in case in all armies. All armies are like that. Here, so you now.
I agree.
you now mentioned 32 Battalion, Jan Breitenbach, and almost immediately at this point, after 2 or 3 weeks on the border, we now had a whole experience with 32 Battalion in Angola. So maybe we can move on to that, where we were now called up to go on Operation Meebos. Now, as I recall it, sorry, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here.
As I recall, and I recall vividly, we were out on patrol. It was towards the end of our 3rd patrol in the bush, and suddenly, for no reason, in fact, it was after that first contact with the Koevoet, almost the same day, we got the instruction late in the afternoon to walk back to base, and we weren't told why. And base was far away.
The main road.
Yeah, base was
50 k's.
50 k's or so.
Cassie will have the distance.
And Cassie, we were 2 platoons together, Cassie and Blackie Swart's platoon. Platoon 3, I think.
Swart's platoon, yeah.
Platoon 2. And we joined up. Joined up, and we were now told that we are going to walk to find the main road, and we weren't quite sure where it was, and we had no idea how far it was. But wow, what a night that was! We left at 5:30. Of course, we'd had an action-packed day with being stopper groups for the Koevoets and the contact and all of that. Now we were told walk, and we walked 1 hour on, and then 5 minutes rest. 1 hour on, 5 minutes rest, and we went the whole night in thick bush, bad bush.
My section in front.
Were there? Oh, it was
my section in front.
We were walking in
and then Blackie killed that snake.
We walked in a long extended line.
Yeah.
And I think around about 4 or 5 in the morning, they let us sleep a little bit for half an hour. Then we got up and walked again. And finally, at about 10 o'clock, we came upon the road. I was with Cassie when Cassie went ahead to go and scout the area, and we saw the most unbelievable sight of one of these old VW combis driving past us. And so the road was right there. It was such a relief. Eventually, we were collected from the road, and we were taken back to Okatope, where we were now given the alarming news that our 2 platoons, I think it was, had been directed to accompany a column of vehicles into Angola, because there was a big operation going on up there, Ops Meebos, where they were attacking enemy bases about 200 kilometers into Angola, and they needed provisions, rat packs, food, ammunition, and they needed gas for the helicopters that were up there. And so they put together a column of 13 vehicles, and we were to be the protection for that. And I remember well how we spent the night in preparation, all very excited. I thought it was unusual that we were such raw troops that we were being tasked with this fairly big responsibility. At any rate, we then went through to Ondangwa the next morning. We were in 6 buffels, 2 platoons. Lieutenant Cassie, our column was commanded by Captain Cook. He was our company commander, came with us. And we arrived at Ondangwa. We picked up our column, and I remember that so well. You know, I remember we arrived, and the column was formed up already, waiting for us for their protection. And the drivers were standing next to their buffels in the shade somewhere, having a smoke. And we drove in, and I think it was Cassie. He looked over the side of the buffel, and he said to them, "Who's in charge here?" And this was a bunch of ragtag ruffians, misfits, including a couple of Rhodesians who'd somehow squeezed their way onto the column as drivers. And they didn't even bother saluting, you know, and they had these cigarettes in their hand. And I remember the one guy looked up at Cassie and he said to him, "A scheme you are." You know, so I thought, okay, this
must have been really
easy to go into Angola with. And there was a big tow truck, one of these massive tow trucks which can pull rattles and things out. And
fittings.
And So we set off. I think we were 3 buffels in front and 3 buffels behind the column. And here we were on that big adventure heading into the other war in Angola. So, Pierre, yeah, let's talk about the war in Angola now. Completely different to Owamboland. Eh? Do you want to summarize the strategies of what was going on there with 3-2 Battalion and so on?
I will start with the Angolans themselves. There were the 3. There wasn't a government yet at that stage because Frelimo, FNLA, and MNLA were at loggerheads with each other.
And it was MPLA, and FNLA.
MPLA, FNLA, and that was a bit earlier, but by the time, because they did form a government. I'm lying because FAPLA was already on its feet. So I'm like, FAPLA was the army, the Angolan army, and they were at loggerheads with UNITA because Savimbi wouldn't go to the negotiation table. He didn't want to be in opposition in the party. So what happened with 3-2 during the height of the civil war there, Breitenbach went across to a place called Limpopo, and he got given command unknowingly of 300 complete ragtag ruffians who had no uniform, no food, nothing. And he forged these guys into an incredible fighting force, which became known as 3-2 Battalion. And they were Angolan troops with white South African NCOs and officers, and they were highly effective. Again, this is a unit that's mixed, and when we sum up maybe at the end of this whole thing, I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I firmly believe that mixed units in Africa, as was shown to be the case in Asia, in Vietnam, those are the most effective units to use if you're fighting an indigenous population that know what they are doing. So 3-2 were highly effective, and they were used almost exclusively externally. So the area of operations was southern Angola most of the time, based at Buffalo in the Caprivi. We did see them internally, but not that often. And they would basically just come to very troubled areas, if you want to call it that, or areas where the South African Defence Force didn't seem to be hacking it. So what happened with the external operations, if I can go there, is that intelligence, photo recon, the small teams units that would go in, they would gather information about camps, training camps, staging camps that were housing SWAPO planned fighters who were on their way to infiltrate South.
Yeah, and confirm these. We're talking about camps that were a long way into Angola, 200 kilometers and more. So you're talking about 32 battalion recce's who would go out there and reconnoiter information on these camps. And then periodically, annually almost, the South Africans would organize an incursion into southern Angola where they would then target these training camps of our enemy, SWAPO. And 32 battalion would be very involved in those operations. And in fact, the 3-2 battalion recce commander at the time on this Ops Meebos when we arrived there was Willem Rutter, who had come out of Rhodesia as well.
Willem Rutter.
So
South African born.
South African, yeah. So Pierre, I remember vividly that trip where we drove from Ondangwa up to the border. It was a good dirt road, and probably took us about 3 hours to get to the Cup Lane, to Oshikango, where Alpha Tower was, this big water tower. And all around us in the countryside.
Features large future.
Yes. And all around us in the countryside, it seemed like pretty normal. You didn't see much sign of the war going on, and there were tilled fields and kraals, and there were people, and there was a fair amount of traffic, bakkies and locals driving around. But once we crossed the Cup Lane, it was a different story. I don't know if that also made an impression on you. we went into this countryside in Angola, which seemingly had been wiped out of local population. There were no people, there was very little infrastructure, and the small hamlets and towns that we came across were uninhabited, and the buildings were all bombed and shelled. And in fact, the road from the Cup Lane to the first large town, which was Ongiva, that road from Alpha Tower to Ongiva, 60 kilometers, was a fairly terrifying road, because every now and then we would come across landmine craters in the middle of the road, these big empty holes, and then perhaps the wreck of a vehicle lying on the side. If there was no wreck, then you knew that that was a South African vehicle that had hit a landmine and then been towed back. And I remember that the vegetation was in parts very thick on the side of the road. We drove down a narrow corridor, and we were all vigilant and concerned that we could be ambushed, easily ambushed. And there was one place where the whole road was blown up, and we had to go off the road and sort of circle around. And it was an altogether different scenario, because you realize, okay, I'm in a different war, and this is something different to the lazy guerrilla war back in Owamboland. This is a country which, by the time we got there, had been fighting a civil war for 7 years, from 1975 or so.
1975.
Yeah, they'd seen a lot of warfare. There'd been a lot of death. I mean, that civil war in Angola, which we were part of because we were supporting UNITA fighting against the Angolan government. You know, in the end, that civil war took about 500,000 lives. It was devastating. And so there was no wonder that we saw no people in the fields. And the kraals were very humble. All we saw were elderly women and very old men, and the fields were largely untended. There was no game around. But we arrived at Onjiva eventually with our convoy, and yeah, quite a big town. It seemed to be a regional headquarters of southern Angola for the Portuguese, and now for the Angolans. But we had captured it a few months prior to our arrival there, so the South African forces were stationed there. Yeah, what are your recollections of Ondjiva in Angola?
Yeah, Steve, it was quite a large town, and we had to drive through it to get to the airport, which that's where we based up for the night. And I remember the devastation. There was no building that I can remember that did not have bullet holes in it, or had been shot up, windows gone, doors broken down, rubble lying in the street. Also remember we were under strict orders not to fraternize with the Red Cross people, who had a house or two houses, you know, but I remember also what I remember is when we drove past them, they were standing outside with their arms folded and these glares of utter hatred focused on us, and I'm going, but what did I do to you? You know, not understanding their reasoning and knowing now what their reasoning was. But
they were women, right?
And there was this beautiful. Sorry?
They were women, yeah.
There were women there, yeah. I remember this beautiful blonde girl with hair down to her waist, and like the look that she gave all of us and the guys. I mean, so we weren't allowed to wave or talk to them because we were under strict orders. But when we got to the airport, we drove up to the airport building, and I think we logged there for the night. We didn't spend the night at the vehicles. Actually, spend the night. There were trenches dug along the edge, either side of the terminal building, where we spent the night. And I also remember there were 105 or G2s that were there, G2 cannons, because I had gone to sleep already, and Johan van Deventer came and woke me up. And one of the artillerymen was a friend of his from school, so he took us. He said he'd show us the weapon. So we went and had a look at the gun. It was quite an impressive thing. I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of the shell that came out of that. I think there were 105 mils.
Yeah,
which is a big piece of work. And then I don't know if you remember, but it struck me because the ZU-23 double-barrel anti-aircraft gun on the
roof
on the roof of the terminal.
Yeah.
Russian made ZSU 23, which also, and that's where I think we saw our first recce's as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were not a lot, some of them walking around the terminal building and beards, and they were just, some of them carried AKs, and you knew this was like you say, this is a different kettle of fish. On the field with the 18. You're not playing on the sea field with the under 10s anymore.
Yeah.
So yeah, it made an impression. But to get back to the road, I remember it was tarred. It was a sealed road.
That's right.
It was raised as well in a lot.
Yeah, it was like a macadam. It wasn't like our roads. It wasn't.
That's right.
Tar. It was like red tar, like a
no. Yeah, that's right. I mean that photograph of your section on the road at the FAPLA standing in front of the FAPLA site. That's on that road.
That's right. Yeah.
So you can see what the texture and what the road looked like. I do remember the vegetation. The road was also raised, which made you feel more exposed, because especially in the start, before you got to Namakunda, because there were these floodplains on either side of the road. And when we patrolled along that road later on, you could see where the culverts had been dug. Some water could flow through between these, and it wouldn't erode away on the walls. So yeah, that did strike me. And then the change of vegetation, which was to my mind, almost instantaneously. It went from almost the dry, dusty, ugly. Well, no, Owamboland's beautiful at times, but it went to a far more lush, a greener type of terrain. And the further north we moved, that continued. But Ongiva was an eye-opener. The signs on the slogans painted on the walls, and I remember the big Kuka sign.
Yeah.
You remember that on one of the building, the beer. Yeah, so yeah, it was an eye-opener. And unfortunately, again, we only heard later from Kasi the whole background, but we weren't really privy to the whole operation then. So, but even within that framework, it was an eye-opener to spend the night there.
So Ondjiva also had those big murals of Stalin and of Karl Marx, and you realized, okay, we're in a communist country now. And then there were wrecked vehicles around in Ondjiva, which were victims of the battle that had been fought there a few months before we got there, including that T-34 Russian tank. That was quite a big shock to me, because I hadn't realized that we would be up against tanks. Nothing we'd done in training had told us how to fight against a tank. I remember being taken aback and stunned by that. I was like, oh no, please. But anyhow, yeah, so Pierre, the memories come flooding back. Man, it was like the Wild West out there, hey? It was the Badlands. And there were some tough characters around. So Ongiva,
definitely wide-eye experience.
Yeah, Ongiva was like the headquarters, and from there the coordination was going where our guys were hitting the enemy bases. So I remember us sleeping in the trenches just next to the main terminal, and then all day Puma helicopters would come in, either with Parabats or with 32 battalion guys, and they were haggard, they were tired. They'd been out attacking the enemy bases, and they were really tired. I also bumped into a friend there in the bats, and he just said a few sentences and then went and lay down in the trench near to us and fell asleep. So it was a real war going on there, and we had the sense of, okay, big stuff happening up north, and that's where we are headed. And we left the next day. So our instructions were, we had been warned not to drive on the road because that was frequently landmined. So I think we started out driving next to the road, and then we take a shortcut across a field, and then join up next to the road again. And that first day, yeah, I remember we made fairly good progress. We headed sort of northeast, And we went through a town called Ivali. There wasn't much there. Similar thing, all the buildings bombed out and so on. And we were heading now for the main collection of our forces up north. At that time, they were somewhere in the Mupa Kuvalai area up north. But they shifted, it appeared. They moved their position because the enemy bases were attacking, those bases were shifting. So our coordinates to get to them, and this was before GPS and before all of that stuff. We were with a map, you know, poor old Cassie in front there and Captain Cook trying to get us to a shifting objective. But on that first day, yeah, we came to Anhanka, and that's where we had our first drama, where we hit the landmine. Where were you when that happened?
Well, Steve, we were ahead of you. We were parked ahead of you. It was on the edge of town, if I remember correctly. We'd stopped. I'm not sure why. Maybe just on a radio or a map reading thing, plotting. And my recollection is that your vehicle moved from behind us to come up almost next to us, or I'm not into shade or something. And I heard this almighty bang, and I had all my guys debus because I thought it was an RPG. Yeah, landmine didn't enter my brain, and they all jumped off. And then I still remember Johan van Deventer jumping off, turning and looking at me, saying, "Why are you not getting off?" The radio was strapped to the roll bar. That's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it. So I was trying to get that off, so I could still have comms, you know. But anyways, we got the guys, and then we realized, no, this is this landmine. Well, you had hit this landmine with the front left wheel, if I'm right. The front left. And, you know, thank the Pope, all of you guys were, there were some injuries, and I mean, Barry with his back, and I think, you know, but you all came out of it alive. But it must have been a hell of a shock to be in that vehicle when it did that. So, I mean, you can explain that, which would be quite interesting.
Yeah, my instant reaction was the same as yours. I thought we'd been hit by a rocket, an enemy rocket. And of course, it was a landmine we had hit, we had driven over. It was a double landmine. It was a Czechoslovakian TM57 mine. And the sappers worked that out by the sheer amount of fragmentation they found lying around there after. And in fact, it seemed that that landmine had not been planted for us South Africans, but it had been planted in the early days of the Portuguese Civil War by the guerrillas in the bush, hoping that the Portuguese would ride over it. So it had been in the sand for 7 or 8 years, you know, if not longer. Yeah, you know, Pierre, a lot of guys who fought in the war were in vehicles that hit landmines. I think we were very lucky, our crowd. We were in a buffel, which, as you know, was built to really protect you from the landmine. It had the V body at the bottom. But fortunately, the critical factor was we were not driving very fast. It hit our front left-hand wheel, and we took off through the air, and I clearly remember the flying through the air feeling. And the explosion, I must tell you, was absolutely enormous. You know, when it happens underneath you, I've never forgotten that. Instantly, I had sort of like an acid secretion in my mouth, you know, like when you go to the dentist, that taste. And that must have been the shockwave coming through our body. It was just this. And then flying through the air and wondering how you're going to land, you know, on your side or you're going to topple over or whatever. But we sort of flew forward, and our front, the front left-hand wheel was gone, but the axle on that side landed in the crater of the landmine. And then we started toppling over into the crater, you know. And I was sitting with my back to the direction we were toppling. So we started going like, you know, like, are we going to go over? And because picture the earth, the earth there, it threw up, was, I mean, it was like we were in a black cloud. And then we kind of managed to stay upright at a little bit of an angle, and there was just shock. We were stunned. There was silence for a bit of time, and then the air turned from black to grey, and I think we all realised, okay, it's probably a landmine. And we started coming to our senses, and the guy next to you, his face sort of came out of the mist, and sort of in anguish and moaning. But fortunately, nobody killed. And I recall that immediately sappers came around us with their landmine detection devices and their headphones, and they told us not to get off the vehicle. They were going to search around us for more landmine devices, AP mines. Eventually we got off and we were directed away, and I just recall sitting there under a tree afterwards, probably a little bit stunned and concussed, and ears really ringing badly, and guys limping about. And once again, I say, we had only been on the border for about 3 weeks. So we were 3 weeks into the war as raw recruits when we hit a landmine. It was quite a sharp introduction to the reality of war. And I just thank my lucky stars that we were okay. We all know of many other guys in those type of vehicle incidents who fared far worse, lost their lives, and so on. But at any rate, the landmine was now immobile, and so they tried to fix it up. They couldn't. We had that big tow truck, and the tiffies in the column, they hooked up the biffle behind them, and we were 10 guys from that landmine vehicle. We were instructed to catch a ride on the back of a truck which was carrying rack packs, and it was the rack packs were packed up in the back and had a netting over it. And as we were bundu bashing, the netting was tearing away, and then the rat pack would fall off, and then we'd jump off, we'd run, and we'd scoop up a rat pack, which was now, we'd scored some treasure, and we'd sit in the back and eat the rat pack, because we had eaten so badly on patrol in the bush. To have these rat packs was fantastic. And so we had this whole adventure of traveling the next couple of days on the back of that truck, and with a lot of shenanigans going on.
Yeah, they were. I mean, we were behind you some of the time, and it was actually quite funny to see the guys jump off and jump back on, and rat packs flying, because the branches would hook underneath the net, camo net, and just yank stuff off. And the driver he didn't see, obviously, because he's concentrating where he goes. Because as you said, we didn't follow any roads. We just bundu bash, really. And was it on that same day, or was it the next day that we saw Rifle 72? I think it was the next day.
That was actually on the way back, after we got to base 9. We then recovered that.
Was it on the way back?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have in my mind, we saw it, went past them, then on the way back, we were tasked to get it because the Marines had got lost.
You may be right.
But anyway, so it was on the way back. Okay.
So that was the
that's why I say, my brain's lazy. I'm going to have to go and refer to Cassie's notes again, and then we can correct ourselves at the start of the next chat.
No, not at all.
But anyway, so what I remember, though, is when we got closer to Mupa were the hills, the first hills we'd seen in forever, because Owamboland was as flat as a bloody pancake, and you could see day and night stacked up in the distance. And then towards Mupa, we saw these beautiful hills. And I think we drove over a saddle between two of these hills that were stretched out east-west, if I'm correct. Beautiful. And the other thing that struck me about that, maybe not the second, maybe the third or the fourth night out, is we didn't lager. We stopped just, at night, and then set up security all along the line of vehicles. I remember standing with Cassie at dusk and looking at this incredibly beautiful forest. We were in a forest. It wasn't thick enough to be a jungle, but it was a forest with these old hardwood trees that had survived for centuries and would be there still for centuries after we'd gone. And just being gobsmacked that here I am with a weapon in my hand and a uniform, and there might be someone behind one of those trees who will be taking me out or watching me. And yet there was this incredible sense of peace in that, for those few minutes that I had there. And it was like it was beautiful, if if a soldier can use that word. It was absolutely beautiful. I remember Cassie and I exchanged a few words around the natural beauty out there, because that struck me. Southern Angola is very beautiful in places. In that area there, when we started even further down to Koevoet, it was like the big green trees and the streams that we would have to cross, and the grass was waist high almost, even in August.
And that
time of the year. Well,
that area
wasn't that green, but it was still, yeah.
That area is now the Meebos National Park, which I'd love to go back to one day. They say it's quite well visited.
Oh, Steve, I have to visit it.
As you say, those hills and those lovely forests, and there was no game. The game had been shot out long before. We never saw much game. But it was also very much, there was evidence all around of a land at war. Do you remember we drove through two enemy bases, which our guys had attacked maybe the day before or 2 days before, and we found the detritus of the battle and all of that. And there was sort of food in plates in the trenches, so the enemy had been caught by surprise. And I remember the one camp had a flagpole with a tatty flag of the enemy, Fapler. And so, and there were fires. Do you remember the fires, Pierre? The fighting seemed to
remember the fires.
These great forest fires. I don't know exactly what, it was obviously incendiary flying around, or there were times when our guys used phosphorus grenades. So it was as if we progressed.
No, go ahead, Steve.
It was
as we progressed.
It was as if we progressed with these great forest fires, and they, at one stage, they impeded our path, and we had to weave through them. And we also had Russian MiG jets flying over us at one stage. I remember that clearly, and I made a note of that in my diary, and being petrified should they attack us, but they either never saw us or they were short on fuel, and they just went ahead to their base. I mean, the amazing thing, Pierre, I'm struck by this. The amazing thing on this particular adventure we were on in Angola was that we never controlled the air. Hey, that's incredible. The enemy controlled the air. Our guys would send in the helicopters if they had to, and they would fly just above the tree lines to try and stay out of the enemy's detection. But in Owamboland, we controlled the air. But our Mirage pilots had firefights in the sky with the MiGs. It hadn't gone well, and of course the enemy had the SAM-7 missile, the Russian missile, which could shoot down our aircraft. That's what made our guys really scared. And then we were a long way from home, hey? We were far behind enemy lines, so to speak. And what also makes an impression on me is the audacity we had. We were young and full of courage and felt invincible. And we were just a column going ahead right through the middle of enemy-controlled territory, almost without a care in the world, seeing all this evidence of the war where the enemy could run into you at any time. And in fact, we drove past an enemy base on about day 3 or 4, and we didn't even know it was there. And they intercepted the radio, on the radio nearby. This sounds like the South Africans moving past us. And then they started chasing us. Do you remember that? And Cassie also talks about this. They started following us. And there was we broke down a lot at Pierre. We had a lot of breakdowns in the bush, broken axles and tires, and it was a difficult journey.
There's a lot of wear and tear on those vehicles because it was thick sand most of the way, and we got no relief from even 2 kilometers on the road. Just around the enemy bases and stuff. Cassie, I can't remember when he took over the navigation. It was on the way up because he realized we were actually moving south. And we got to this water hole, and I never saw it, but he got off there and he said he went absolutely ice cold because it was covered with chevron boot tracks.
Yeah.
And that's the boot pattern that was issued on the boots that were issued to Plan and Fatma. and he said he just got ice cold because he thought if we get hit here, it's going to be big. So that could have been very close to that base that we did pass, and that they did come after us, but they didn't follow us for very long.
No.
I think at that stage, because of the audacity the South Africans had shown constantly, and the skill which they conducted their operations, as well as the esprit de corps that existed amongst the troops, that they knew that we'd probably get a bloody nose, even if they were outnumbering us or any other South African force that took on. So yeah, I mean, I remember the two bases. I remember Cassie on the radio. Pas op vir die MiGs. Pas op vir die MiGs. Whenever we heard they were coming. Just to get back to the air war side of it. I mean, I think they didn't shoot any of our planes down. We had losses through anti-aircraft and through missiles. But our loiter time, the time that the Air Force could spend, especially in mirages, because the mirages, if I speak under correction, were never hanged at Ondangwa. They came from Hoedspruit or from here, from Waterkloof. And why I say that is that Keith Roberts, who was a lecturer at that stage at Tux, he's a geologist, I worked with him, and he said his house was nearby in those days, and he would know if an external op was running, because the MiGs would be taking off and landing constantly. I mean, the MiGs, the Mirages. So, whereas the Angolan and Cuban pilots, I don't think the Cubans there yet, but the Angolan pilots, they could go to Sarimo, Sarimo's more, but they could go to a base that was 400-500 clicks away. Their turnaround time was a lot faster. And they did have superior aircraft to outdated Mirages. But, all credit to the Blue Jobs. They made it work with what they had. And they showed unbelievable skill and courage sometimes.
Yeah.
But there was constant fear because we didn't have aircraft assets in the air. There was this constant fear of us being hit by MiGs.
That's right. And
I don't remember
their base, I think, was Lubango, the MiG base, which was west of Ondjiva.
That's it, not Sarima. Sarima's for the north.
Yeah,
Lubango. So the turnaround time for them was quick, and I think it was a standard procedure on that operation for us. And then we got to a cut line, and it was actually swept first by a section of infantry. And part of that was actually also to act as a spotter while so your buffle went across, if I remember correctly. I could speak under correction. Like, it's 1982, Steve. Anyway, but it was swept. And I'm not sure if we stayed security while all the vehicles passed by, but it was, we would sweep the cut line first. And part is because of the MiGs, and also the sappers would actually then also just, because cut lines, was it who hit the mine on the cut line? On one of the cut lines, Because remember, we were told you don't drive down a cut line.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And even if you have to cross it, check it carefully. It was an adventure, but it took us a lot longer than we should have to get to the helicopter administrative area, the HAA. And it's largely, I think the small mistake in the navigation, and also because they kept moving it, because this is a far more fluid battle than I think they initially envisaged. The Fapla as well as plane didn't stand and fight. They would melt away rather, and then they would identify another base closer or further away or close by, and then they would be attacked the next day, the day after. And then I remember we got into the HA. I can't remember what time of day it was, but I was so impressed seeing the choppers parked, the Allos parked, and I think it was a canteen that you could buy drink and beer from.
That's right. We got to the HA.
I remember, but then I got.
What did HAA stand for? Helicopter. It was sort of a local
helicopter administrative area.
Administrative area. That's right.
No.
It was next to a river. Pierre.
Helicopter administrative area.
Next to a river. This beautiful.
That's right. Yeah, beautiful, clear green water.
clear water, wide, hard-flowing river, which I think was a tributary of the Kunene further up. Crystal cold water, and the guys who had hit the landmine, we were filthy. You know, I remember being blackened by mud and having mud clogged in my hair. And so we eventually got up to that river a few days later after many breakages and breakdowns and everybody trying to help fix up the vehicles. We had a couple of guys with us in the platoon who were pretty good mechanically and sort of boom after plumb, fix things up. We also had those tiffies who traveled in the back of the recovery vehicle, and those guys were a treat. They stayed drunk permanently. I don't know if you remember that. And they just loved to work.
The one drove my buffalo.
Say again?
The one guy drove our buffalo. I don't know who the driver was in my buffalo, but he kicked him out and said, "I'm driving this." Because he was an Oman, he drove. He was a bloody maniac, but folks loved him. It was a complete nutter. But they did. You know, I'm sure he drove under the influence of something. If it wasn't alcohol, it was something else. But
they had
very cool like that.
They had crates of beer stacked in the back of their it was compartments. Half of it was tools and the other half was beers. And they were bored most of the time. And, but the minute a vehicle broke down, they leapt off that vehicle.
Oh, Steve, you're breaking up.
Their faces lit up. Can you hear me? So the link is unstable.
I can hear you now. Yeah.
But the minute they had work to do, they were thrilled, you know, they jumped, and they were bloody good, man. I remember they swapped out our axle and our biffle, which had, where the landmine had hit. They fixed it up in a couple of hours. It was incredible what they did. They were having a ball. We're still recording. Yes, and then Pierre, we must also say that moving in tandem with us was 6-1 Mech in the Rattles, although we didn't see much of them, because it was one of their Rattles that was hit just down from us. And that was the Rattle that we came across. And the guy who was killed there was Daryl Cruiser. And he and I had grown up in the same neighborhood together. And I remember it was a really devastating scene. That Rattle, it hit a landmine. It hit a couple of cheese burns. And it was very sad. And that was
double cheese.
Double cheese, yeah. That was the first casualty, I think, you know, that
double cheese.
Yes, in 2 different
3 people killed, if I remember correctly, Steve.
And so for me personally, that, you know, that really made things hit home, because I actually knew the chap in there who had died. A lot of the others were injured and so on. But as you say, we eventually got to the HAA at the river. There were 22 helicopters there, 22, a mixture of Pumas and gunships, mostly gunships. And there was artillery defending the HAA. And then there was parachute battalion and 32 battalion. And then Willem Rutter was operating from there, and he had his recce's out, reconnoitering SWAPO bases. It was, I remember, a very frustrating operation for the Bats and for 32 Battalion, because somehow SWAPO seemed to be disappearing just before our guys hit them. But at any rate, that operation was we suffered big losses there. We lost 29 men, I think it was. And that was, a lot of them were in that helicopter that went down, that Puma. So there were 12 guys, and 3 guys. And I remember we knew guys on the helicopter as well. That was a very sad occasion. It affected us all a lot. What are your memories of that, how that happened?
Just, Steve, I remember the HAA, and I think we only heard of the chopper having gone down after we left the HAA. We turned around, because I think we only spent a day there, maybe even less, as we brought that big empty convoy back out with us, far bigger. And we heard about that after the fact. But it is a shock, because these are guys you might have spoken to in the HAA. And Barry knew,
Grant.
Can't remember the guy's name. He knew one of the bads as well.
Kroll, yeah.
Grant, that's right, Grant Kroll. And he introduced you to Grant. I can't remember. Yeah. I didn't meet him. But I know he and Barry had a couple of beers together there.
That's right, yeah. That was a really sad incident.
And then we heard about that afterwards, but yes.
They had taken off from the HAA. They were in a formation of 4 helicopters, and quite by random, they flew over enemy artillery piece that shot down one of the helicopters. And there was we were sort of on our heading. We had left.
Can I just jump in? Sorry. Regarding that, they had been, I can't remember who was the operation commander, but he'd been warned by Willem Ratter's guys not to fly over the Shonnas, because on the northern side of the Shonnas there was anti-aircraft capability. And I don't know if the information just died there, or if the pilots were told and they ignored it, but they unfortunately flew straight over. They changed their flight path slightly. They may not even, but that's neither here nor there. That's hindsight. But apparently Willem Ratter's men had warned them not to fly over that area.
And that
like you say, that they were there, but they had.
That was right next to the Meebos National Park.
They had.
Carry on, Pierre.
That's right, yeah. No, sorry. I was just going to say, regarding SWAPO, they had some sort of, and I wouldn't call it specialized early warning systems, because the guys in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe now used the same thing. They would actually tether monkeys in the trees, or baboons, who would bark or chatter. So I'm not saying, I don't know if they had that, but they certainly did have their eyes and ears out, and they did keep a step ahead of us for that entire operation. Like you say, it was for the guys in front there, would have been immensely frustrating.
Yeah,
because to pitch up into empty camp after empty camp, and like you said, some of the camps we saw were plates of food stores, so they were busy eating, and they got the command to evacuate.
Yeah.
So we that's sort of my recollection, and I know you've got a story, but
I don't.
Go ahead, Steve.
I don't recall which story you're referring to, but I do remember that from there we left and we went down and we recovered that rattle that Daryl had been killed in, and we then towed it back to Ongiva. We may have taken it all the way back to Southwest Africa. I don't recall, but come a point we were now sent back to Ongiva. We had a much longer column for some reason that we were now protecting. More vehicles had joined it, and we picked up that destroyed rattle. We got back to Ongiva. It was fairly uneventful going back, as I recall. And then from Ongiva, we made our way back down to our base at Okatope. And I remember arriving back in Owamboland and how different it was, and we were back in this sleepy war, which seemed a lot less intense and a lot safer than the world we had just come from. But I also remember feeling a little bit older, and a little bit wiser. We had seen things, and we'd been through a little bit of the mill there, and arriving back at Okatope. And of course, there were a lot of guys there who had not been with us. And we had a hell of a party that night. It was Guy Spillhouse's 21st birthday. I remember clearly. And it was one hell of a night. Beers, canteen, music playing. And the next night, Pierre, the very next night was when the entertainment people brought that singer along, Kallie, to come and perform for us in the canteen. Yeah. Oh, I think that was an unwise decision, and they should not have done that.
It was very, because there was a guitarist with a guy called Ronnie Donk.
Yeah.
And I think they gave, I don't know, they gave the show in the troops canteen, didn't they?
Yes, yes.
Because that was bigger. I don't know if it's big. They gave it there, yes. But then remember, there were the two canteens, the one that the officers and the NCOs had, and then the troops canteen. So after the show, they came into the troops canteen, and I think it was Psycho van Rensburg. I speak under correction, but someone, when we moved into Okatopi, one of those corporals found an ear, not an ear, a finger.
A finger, yeah. Yeah, no.
A finger that mounted.
The shenanigans
on the chain. And he had this around his neck, but now he's drunk. And he's trying to stick this thing in King Kallie's ear.
Gosh, yeah.
And there was a liaison captain, a woman there, and she absolutely lost it.
Yeah, I remember.
Cassie can tell more about, what she all threatened, because what we did essentially is we just took our beers and quietly left, because this is now not something we want to be caught up in. Like if the officer group's going to be clawed on, then let them be clawed on by their own. But the stories about Psycho are legendary. I mean, the thing was Psycho.
Yeah, he earned the name. He earned the name well. But I remember it was really boorish behavior with that young girl. She just had no idea what she was letting herself and her band. And we were out of control. We'd been up in Angola, and I wonder what her memories are like of that particular event.
I'm sure she could tell some colourful stories.
I'm sure, yeah. So Pierre, that then took us to the rest of our time at Okatopi, which was another month or two, and we were back to normal patrols. They were sort of 5-day, 7-day patrols in, out. We also did some vehicle patrols, and we did some sweep operations. There was a variety of things. We did a grab operation where we went along to Ondangwa, that funky town area, and we searched all the places.
Yes.
It was back to the sleepy kind of war of not much happening, struggling to find the enemy, being very, very frustrated when we're out on patrol, yet maintaining our vigilance and sort of bush silence, and then coming back to the base and having one hell of a party. There was this kind of rotation of things going on here. And the only other thing we haven't spoken about at Okatopi, as I recall, was we had to guard that bridge about 5 or 6 kilometers away on the tar road. Remember that?
Up the road at the junction of the gravel road that goes off to Okankolo, just north of it. Yeah.
And we seemed to do a rotation of guard duty.
So I think it was a platoon at a time.
Or a section at a time. There were bunkers there. Terrible place. Terrible place. Dusty. There was a dam there. We slept in those bunkers. Sand, fleas, and flies, and our food was bad, and it was just it was horrible. Not good memories, eh?
Yeah. No, those were no. I remember standing guard duty, and I remember also being an incredibly open area. There were these little clumps of bush and the odd makalani palm trees standing around, but it was really flat, and quite open. And I didn't like being there because the exposure. It sounds strange, but the exposure was too much.
Yeah.
The road into Ongiva, you didn't have exposure, and that was also bad. But I almost preferred that than being a sore thumb in the landscape, standing out,
Yeah.
Because there was cover. There wasn't much cover. No, he's smart.
and Pierre, I remember
Steve. I remember that.
We did some section patrols there as well. And we had some fun and games as well. I recall there was one time we were on patrol and Steve Alkers was shouting and misbehaving himself, and then we pounced on him and we tied him up. We tied his hands behind his back and put something around Velcro on his mouth. And I mean, we made light of it where we could. I think a lot of the time we were sort of bored. We couldn't find the enemy. We got up to mischief. They used to sell vet cook there that we used to buy from the locals. And I remember, of course, one time being in that damn bunker at the bridge. The bridge had been blown up once before, which is why we had to guard it.
That's right.
But I remember myself and I think it was Trevor being there, and we decided to shoot off the RPG for fun. You know, you leave troops alone and they get up to mischief, and it wasn't my fault. It was all Trevor.
Trevor Rolfie.
Yeah, it was all.
Yeah, Trevor Rolfie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Brew, how do we shoot this thing? And he was like, you trained on it at Okatope, which I had, at Oshivelo, which I had done. And so eventually, you know, under his pressure, we've got the gun together, we screwed the projectile and the thing together, we put it in the RPG, and Trevor held it, and then he said, you know, is there a safety catch here? And I said, I don't know, I forget, you know. We were like clueless. And sure we should be firing this thing, you know, and just aim down there, and eventually fired the damn thing off down the Shona inland like that, you know, went streaking off down there. It was great fun, and then, we're going to do it again tomorrow, you know, this kind of thing. So we got up to a lot of mischief.
Yeah.
I was saying in my notes here from my diary, I've covered all the major sections. The one thing I do have is we did a few patrols to Onatingi School, where we went to scout out, but we never found any trace of the enemy there. The places that I remember around Okatopi are Onatingi School, Ilombe, Onayena, which was Funky Town, and later on we would revisit that at our next base. And then, of course, the bridge. So it was an eventful time. Yeah, it was a fairly mild introduction to the border, except, I guess, for our participation in Ops Meebos. And we spent three months at Okatopi, and then time came to move on to Okankolo. Yeah. So, Pierre, we've spoken for an hour and a half. I wonder if we should can it there. And when we pick up again, we move on to Okankolo.
Steve,
so, thanks a lot, Pierre. Been good chatting once again.
Yeah.
I'm gonna
no worries. Thanks very much, Steve, and I look forward to the next one.
Pleasure, mate. Pleasure.